Welcome back, Heroes of the Horde and Adventures of the Alliance. The release of this video marks a landmark for the channel.
Huzzah! Champagne and cheese for all!
Since it represents our first rewritten steps out beyond the comfy, warm center of vanilla and into the messy, tangled, constantly backtracking adventure held together more by faith than structure that is WoW's expansions. It is my intention to try to cover these chapters more economically with no more than a video or two per expansion. I'd actually wanted to strictly limit myself to a single video per expansion, but that idea didn't really hold up the further back that we went. What can I say? They just don't make them like they used to, and covering base release content and patches was just a bit too dense, not just in terms of volume, but also in topical complexity. WoW's expansions really do expand.
Oh, you don't say.
Not merely the world, but the vehicles of the narrative. For example, as the map expands, so too do the Alliance and Horde. The Burning Crusade welcomed two of Warcraft's greatest staple races into the game for the first time and completely warped the fantasy of what each faction represented going forward.
Sorry, could you explain that to me like I was a grunt?
Sure. In vanilla, the visual design theory for player races reads pretty clean. The Alliance was the faction of otherwise humanoid races. Humans, stocky humans, micro-humans, you name it. While the Horde visually reads as the race of goblinoids, or to put it differently, the monster races. Nelfs and zombies were meant to be foils to that design in this and in other ways, as we've discussed before, but they still read in the same visual style. Night elves might have fangs and purple skin, but they're still humanoid, and while undead are human bodies in concept, their hunched frames and skeletal claws bring them in line with the other monsters of the Horde. The Burning Crusade decided to take that visual rulebook and toss it out the window by setting humanoid blood elves, arguably Azeroth's most conventionally attractive race, to the Horde, and the facially monstrous yet inherently gentle Draenei to the Alliance. In just about every way, the Belfs and the Draenei become the new foil races, but manage to do so without supplanting their predecessors' narrative roles. Blood elves bring hedonism and, more importantly, arcane proficiency to the Horde, while the Draenei bring a deeply rooted and multifaceted sense of spirituality to the Alliance in a way that the institution of the Holy Light had not managed to do previously. In essence, they read as a piece of the Alliance joins the Horde, while a piece of the Horde joins the Alliance, aesthetically, culturally,
even mechanically, as these races granted exclusive access to the Paladin and Shaman classes for their opposing factions.
Both races feel like they would belong more comfortably in the other faction, and that's exactly the point. The conflict is progressing. The Lions aren't so simple anymore. The Draenei share a deep cultural and historical connection with the Orcs, having shared a homeworld with them for several thousand...
Wait. Chronicle says it's only hundreds of years now.
Fine, hundreds of years. Meanwhile, the Blood Elves were actually in the Alliance all the way up through Warcraft 3, and this new choice to join the Horde has led to some of the story's most messy and uncomfortable lore diffusions. Despite telling us the in-game census statistics, the Blood Elves became a race divided, and though in-game, mechanically, only Horde players would be allowed access to the race, specific in-lore elven factions and characters remained devoted to the Alliance. This has kept the division alive all the way up to, well, they're still divided, to be frank. This is the whole premise of Midnight. Hey, Harden, go check the forums to see how many people have asked for playable High Elves in the last few days alone.
I can't count that high.
Actually, come to think of it, both races came in with a fresh batch of controversy. Oh, on the flip side, the Draenei controversy had a much more limited shelf life, though it seemed far more dramatic at the time. While Quel'Thalas was a clear absence felt throughout vanilla, and a loose end from Warcraft 3, Blizzard didn't really know where to go for the new Alliance race. I've heard a long-standing rumor that the Pandaren were originally slated to join the Alliance when the Belfs joined the Horde, and I've never actually been able to prove or disprove that, but for whatever reason, the powers that be decided to go in an unpredictable direction, knowing that Illidan would feature centrally in this chapter, and given that they were already using Kael'thas's Blood Elves for the Horde, they looked to the rest of Illidan's team, Akama and Vash, to take their cue. Now, Naga don't have feet, so they're out, and that left the Draenei. But there was still an issue.
What the hell is even that?
But you see, hell is exactly the answer. I've seen the Draenei called many things.
Damn octopus-faced space goats.
And while at best they could be called visually confusing and at worst called bloated and over-designed, I have never seen anyone acknowledge what they're actually meant to represent in WoW. All Warcraft races are inspired by fantasy mythology, but then with a Warcraft twist. Gnomes plus cyberpunk equals the Nomergon Exiles. Minotaurs plus North American indigenous peoples equals Tauren. Werewolves, goblins, satyrs all have a cleanly readable mythological inspiration. But what are the Draenei? The answer is they are meant to be Hellspawn, or demons. For lack of a better analogy, they are Warcraft's tieflings, and while I agree that distinction gets a bit lost in their visual design, you need only look at their lore to see the proof of the concept.
You mean their retconned lore?
Yes, and there. That is the controversy. Dating back to the manual in Warcraft 3, the Eredar Lords, the race of demons to which Archimonde and Kil'jaeden belong, were referenced as the oldest evils in the Warcraft universe and responsible for the corrupting of the Titan Sargeras, turning him from champion of the Pantheon to Azeroth's Mega Satan. It wasn't speculation, it was canon published in the literature facts that came with every single copy of Warcraft 3. Then, out of nowhere, here come the Draenei, who look exactly like the Demon Lord Archimonde, but who worship the Holy Light and whose introduction specifically contradicts that established lore. Suddenly, it wasn't the Eridar who corrupted Sargeras, but Sargeras who corrupted the Eridar. And the Draenei, who we had met before in the Warcraft RTS, were now also members of the Eridar race, who, instead of becoming demons, became holy pilgrims who traveled through space on a crystal spaceship. People were not pleased,
to say the least.
And in response to their confusion and displeasure, Metzen took to the forums and did something I've never seen a developer do before or since. He admitted he fucked up. Paraphrasing his blue post, he explained that he wrote the lore bits in the manual around 4 years prior, and he had honestly just forgotten that he had written it. He then apologized to the players, told them that they deserved better, and even more amazing, he stuck to his guns and promised that the new version of the Draenei was stronger and better for the lore going forward. It was a thing of beauty, and it connected with players in a way that modern Blizzard, with all their corporate media training, manufactured meme speech, and aggressively forced awkward wholesome laughter, can't even begin to fathom. And he was right. The Draenei are, as it stands, about the only player race that are so iconic they can't be divorced from the Warcraft setting. Hellspawn tieflings though they may have been, they ended up throwing too much into the pie and it came out bizarre. Hooved feet. Check. Tails. Check. Colored skin. Check. Horns.
Maybe. The girls have them, that's for sure.
Face tentacles.
Check. Wait, what? Why?
They also got given huge upper bodies inspired by the Superman comics. Their cultural style evokes the traveling Roma people, while also drawing in elements from the Middle East and Asia Minor. They were given access to shamanism, but as a whole, their culture embraces the Holy Light far more centrally. There's just too much happening all at once, and that's not even considering the issue of the broken. Material lore retcon aside, Akama was already canonically a Draenei from Draenor, and he did not look like Archimonde or Kil'jaeden. So on top of the Draenei retcon, we also needed a bit of side lore to establish that a bunch of Draenei got transformed by some weird, never explained even to this day, orc fel poison.
Actually, it was explained that it was a fel-modified version of the ogre-engineered bioweapon called Red Pox.
Oh, damn. Is that the same thing Garrosh had?
Yep.
Well, anyway, it warped their faces, devolved their minds, and severed their connection to the light, while opening up a path to the elements. So not only did we get holy demons, we got holy, ugly demons.
It's a whole mess.
It is, and one I intend to clean up. But I need to make it clear that it's not because I don't love the Draenei, but rather because I want to bring them closer to what I think they were originally meant to be, while still keeping that essential element that they became. The broken will play into it, but more importantly, their leaders will play into it, for both the Draenei and the Blood Elves.
Blood and thunder! What's the plan?
Well, first off, here's the big change. The story of player races, with only a few rare exceptions, are told through their racial leaders. Tyrande and Malfurion's struggle align directly with the struggles of all Night Elves, coming to terms with their mortality, as is the case with Sylvanas and the Forsaken, well, until...
Nope. Me not listening.
Anyway, these characters, similar to Thrall and Jaina, were stories that we wanted to see more of. The issue with the Blood Elves and the Draenei is that their established leaders, Kael'thas and Akama, are hit with the Fall to Corruption bat in order for Blizzard to have more marketable raid bosses for the Burning Crusade. In their absence, we're given Lor'themar Theron, the Regent Lord of Quel'Thalas, stewarding his people in Kael'thas' absence, who will struggle for the entire breadth of the game to escape his predecessor's shadow and one day become interesting in his own right. And the Prophet Velen, an eons-old Draenei that was once a peer to Archimonde and Kil'jaeden, who broke from the race of demons to follow the light and lead his people to escape the damnation of the Legion and travel across the stars. Both leaders bring different issues to the table. Velen, for his part, is written by necessity to be a passive shepherd of his cosmically exiled people, but one whom never acts with any real agency of his own, until Legion, which I think we can all agree was totally badass. While Lor'themar, some 2 decades later, would finally get his own badass cold line in the Midnight cinematic, but who otherwise exists as a big nothing sandwich, centrally defined by his relationship to other characters, such as Kael'thas, Sylvanas, Alleria, and even Thalyssra whenever she rolls around. So this leads me to the biggest change we've made in this series yet, and one that I was excited to do since the very beginning, but one that's going to take a lot of work on the back end. Are you ready? We're not killing off Kael'thas Sunstrider.
Wait, what?
That's right. In fact, not only are we not killing him, he's going to remain the leader of the Blood Elves, and he will full-on join the Horde.
Can we even do that?
You bet your floating green orbs we can.
No, that changes, like, the entire story of WoW.
I know, that's the point. But don't worry, I've thoroughly considered this, and if you think about it, there's almost no scene that Lor'themar is in that isn't made stronger for Kael'thas taking his place. Consider the few times Lor'themar is put in charge of a horde operation. He's almost always set up opposite to Jaina Proudmoore, a frost mage, while Kael'thas is primarily a fire mage. That juxtaposition is fun, but also, Jaina and Kael do share a complicated romantic history. Kind of one-sided, but that same thing also naturally lends itself to the eventual conflict with Arthas, which Kael can now be present for. He can be alive in Wrath, and he gets a second crack at Arthas, who murdered his dad, King Anasterion, alongside most of his kingdom and people. Finally, just look at him. He's cool as hell. They're still marketing this guy to this very day.
That's true, he is cool as hell, but that seriously changes the entire story of the Burning Crusade.
Yes, it does. And that's good. If you take a hard look at the story of Warcraft 3 before playing TBC, the betrayal and corruption of Kael'thas is almost as poorly done as the fall of Sylvanas in Shadowlands. His story and the story of the Sin'dorei is one of survival through crippling addiction. Yes, his fall conveys the tragedy of finally succumbing to that struggle, which could be powerful, except that his story was never signposted to do that. Kael'thas Sunstrider was the prince of a ruined nation who would have sacrificed anything in the pursuit of power, but he sought that power exclusively to save his people. To decide off-screen that his fellow addiction got the better of him, and he elected to abandon his people in order to serve the Burning Legion, amounts to nothing short of character assassination. It's like when Game of Thrones tried to gaslight you into thinking they had warned you about Daenerys' Mad Queen ending by listing out all the war crimes she had committed, but don't look at me, Game of Thrones! You're the one who backed her with a heroic soundtrack and a Messiah scene!
You good?
No. Whatever. Anyways, Kael'thas. Right. Aside from preserving his character, it adds a layer to the Horde chemistry which is otherwise absent. Thrall is Shaman, Cairn is Warrior, Vol'jin is Shadowhunter, Sylvanas is Ranger, and Lor'themar is Ranger, but Sword. With Kael'thas in the mix, now the Horde has a mage. A blood mage, in fact.
Okay, but how are we going to do the Sunwell and Magister's Terrace?
Worry not, friends. There happens to be another already established to be evil character perfectly positioned in the roster, ready to step in and take the prince's place.
Really? Who's that?
Nah. No spoilers. Anyway, naturally I couldn't just give the Horde a new leader and ignore the Alliance, so while Kael'thas will continue to define his people, so too shall Akama bring his unique brand to the Alliance as Exarch Akama, an exile defined by both his rejection by the light and his continued devotion to its holy places, such as Karabor. Akama is the weary servant his people need, capable of decisive action, devoted to his faith and to his people's rituals, but also entirely capable of getting his hands dirty and seeing the gray area in between. Now, nobody panic, I'm not planning on axing Velen or Lor'themar. They can still exist and serve the exact same narrative function they have up to now, which is to say none, but we'll still keep them around. Lor'themar will serve as Kael'thas' right hand, the Sarfang to his thrall or the Crowley to his Greymane, while Velen's dynamic will have to be a bit different. It was always implied by the in-game lore that the Prophet was a vital asset to the Draenei people, and that they were willing to sacrifice themselves to protect him. This was tied into his greater power and devotion to the light, and his ability to look into the Great Dark and find safe refuge through the cosmos for his people. Canonically, his foresight was diminished when his people crashed onto Draenor. I'd like to preserve this idea and lean a bit more heavily into it. Velen in the new story is the spiritual symbol of the Draenei faith, but after the crash, he is locked perpetually in a state of deep meditation, awakening to guide his people, then falling back into the depths of his mind and prayers. His protection falls to the likes of the Vindicators, or the Sha'tar, but it leaves the role of day-to-day leadership vacant, which is where the Council of Exarch, and Akama specifically, step in, becoming, for lack of a good Warcraft analogy, the Cyclops to Velen's Professor X. And you may now continue not panicking, because we're not going to sanitize or buff down either of their rough edges. Kael and Akama will both still have their obsessions in this story arc. In fact, we fully intend for them to remain raid bosses. They make up a critical dynamic with Illidan's inner circle, and actually, speaking of that, it's probably about time to start discussing the absolute ensemble cast of characters that Illidan managed to assemble for us in this expansion. You see, the Burning Crusade's flagship storyline brought us into conflict with the maddened, self-styled Lord of Outland, who was never officially confirmed KIA after his duel with Arthas on the slopes of Icecrown.
It was just heavily implied.
Explained away in the BC manual, after losing his 1v1, Illidan fled the wrath of his demonic masters to Outland, where he sat in his room, blasted MCR, and brooded over his shower thoughts, knowing he would have totally beat Arthas if the Death Knight hadn't cheated. No, really, seriously, he swears. Illidan's new characterization as a full-on villain and not a broody anti-hero obsessed with power, while not quite as hard to swallow as Kael'thas' corruption, did also cause a few rumblings in the community. His fall isn't something we can change, since the entire bones of Outland's narrative rests on us conflicting with the Illidari. Regardless, while Illidan has clearly lost his mark marbles since taking Frostmourne to the groin. He must have negotiated a hell of a healthcare package for the Illidari because his roster is completely packed. There's of course the aforementioned Kael'thas Sunstrider and Akama, joined by the fearsome Lady Vash, who is probably Illidan's only truly loyal vassal. But aside from that core four in the inner circle, there's also seriously massive names from Warcraft's previous titles who have chosen to take up with the Betrayer. Kargath Bladefist, for one, a legendary orc warrior, chieftain of the Shattered Hand clan, and former playable hero unit in Warcraft 2.
This guy is the namesake for Orgrimmar's naval port, Bladefist Bay, which means Thrall held him in esteem with the likes of Duraton for Duratar, Orgrim Doomhammer for Orgrimmar, and Grommash Hellscream for Grommash Hold.
His mind has been utterly lost to the fell blood of yet another pit lord, and he's been crowned the war chief of the Fell Horde, a group of more or less feral fell orcs who operate out of Hellfire Citadel. He's so far gone the guy actually cut off his other hand and replaced it with another blade, and because that's hilarious, I'd actually like to push that further with another page out of Hearthstone's playbook. In the Ashes of Outland expansion, a subpack called Trial by Fellfire establishes a sect of demons who were augmenting themselves with machinery and calling themselves the Rusted Legion. This led to fell-punk versions of Illidan's lieutenants in a way that was not to be taken seriously, but then again, driving with themes of the Shattered Hand, mutilation, and body modification, coupled with new fell-blind madness, I think the Fell Horde will be embracing this fanatical augmentation idea. Kargath in our story will take on the visual appearance of Kargath Prime.
Without the name, because it's dumb.
And Illidan's Fell Horde will be a race of demonically and mechanically enhanced Fell Orcs. Beyond Kargath, there's also Gruul, the Dragon Killer, Lord of all surviving Gron.
For those not aware, a Gron is a creature roughly the size of a mountain,
who famously fought against Deathwing, killed a bunch of his kids, impaled them on some mountains, and is now locked in a hood-style beef with everyone who's ever lived. Last but not least is Terran Gorfin, Warcraft's first ever Death Knight, a former member of the Shadow Council under Gul'dan and alongside Cho'Gall, who after being slaughtered by Ogrim Doomhammer, had his soul ripped from death and stuffed into the rotting corpse of a Stormwind Knight. This type of Death Knight predates Arthas and even the Lich King, and while he isn't technically active at the start of the expansion since he was killed off by Turalyon in Warcraft 2, it's implied that his disembodied soul maintains some kind of influence, even in his hands-off capacity. This 7-man lineup of Illidan and his lieutenants holds some serious narrative chops and could create a dangerously compelling group of antagonists if framed properly. Members of Blizzard have remarked during BlizzCon panels that Outland feels a bit aimless when compared to other expansions, and while I agree, I think that's only because the central antagonists are united on paper alone. By presenting this united front made up of a mosaic of motley misfits and monsters, the narrative sharpens into a clear frame. The cult of personality centered around the fallen Stormrage has seized control of Outland, and with the Dark Portal reopened, they now threaten Azeroth. That means it's up to you, the champions of Azeroth, to put an end to that threat, and you've got shiny new allies to help you do it. Which is probably as good a time as any to zoom us down to ground level, back to the Griffin's Gamble Lodge and the Red Roar Den.
That's right. The Guildhall's got names now.
In Stormwind, the Knights of the Lost Ashes make their preparations to brave the Dark Portal, much as those immortalized in the Valley of Heroes once did before them. While across the seas in Orgrimmar, the Thunderlord militia prepare themselves to travel to the Horde's lost homeworld and discover what remains of their people and culture following the reckless actions of Ner'zhul. In these moments, with an almost impossible level of symmetry,
just suspend your disbelief, guys. Don't be dicks.
The two guilds are met with the arrival of one new ally each. Yes, that's right. With 2 new races comes the 2 new guildies to join our adventure. 2 new tunes to run dailies with, and 2 new friends to either tank, heal, or stand in fire as you see fit. Some of y'all hate when I do this, but the video that established our guild characters remains our second highest watched video to date. So, whatever, here we go. Keeping with the tradition, we tried to use characters not to indulge in making our own OCs, but to explore the racial perspectives and highlight otherwise obscure facets of their society that we might not otherwise include. Starting with the Horde this time, the Thunderslayers are joined by the uneasy countenance of Tannen Hawkwing, Sindori rogue and former member of the Convocation of Silvermoon. Alongside the Sunstrider dynasty, the Kingdom of Kel'Thalas was governed by the assorted elven nobility, and by custom, the 7 greatest lords were invited to join a high council, known as the Convocation of Silvermoon. Elven politics is often referenced as a complex, ever-shifting dance of power and allegiances. Only the greatest elven nobles or magisters were ever granted one of the 7 seats at the Convocation's table.
Whoa, so they must be some big names. Who were some of the 7?
We literally have almost no clue. We only ever get 2 names, and I'm not sure they even sat at the table at the same time. There was the previous Grand Magister Belovir, and the traitor-scourged fanatic Darkhan Drathier. We know of no others, but we do know that the Convocation were behind the creation of the Council of Tirisfal, in conjunction with several Dalaran magicrats, and that it was the Convocation, not King Anastarion, who made the elves out to be such huge douche canoes during the Second War. So, since there are no less than 6 unaccounted for seats, that are unlikely to ever be filled, I'm going to go ahead and take one of those seats for Lady Tenon Hawkwing. An elven fencer and rogue, distantly related to Silvermoon's current ranger general, Halderon Brightwing, who also never gets enough recognition. Seated during Arthas's invasion, she renounced her title following the destruction of the Sunwell and set to work rebuilding her kingdom. Declining to follow Prince Kael'thas to Outland, she instead rolled up her sleeves and headed to Sunstrider Isle to help rebuild the Sunspire and Falthrian Academy. The quest lines of the Blood Elf starting zones have you travel through Eversong Woods and the Ghostlands, meeting famous Sindori faces like the Blood Matriarch Liadrin, first the Blood Knights, who are presently doing some shisty things with a Naru that we will discuss later, Grand Magister Romath, student of Prince Kael'thas and current leader of the Magisters, Halderon Brightwing, once a ranger under Sylvanas Windrunner, who has taken up the role of Ranger General in the Windrunner family's absence, and Lorthamar Theron, the sitting regent of Quel'Thalas, while Prince Kael'thas is off on Outlands in the service of Illidan. Meanwhile...
Nope, we're not doing that.
Yeah, you're right. The dour priest, Nikoro, approaches the Ash Knights and tells them of his own journeys. A former blade master, Nikoro put down his blade after he found his true calling to be that of a priest and not a warrior. And not just any priest, but a priest of the Auchenai, a curiously macabre little subsect of Durrani society. They are effectively death priests who tend to souls trapped in the pull of a dead Naru. See, when Velen led his people off Argus and away from the Burning Legion, they were accompanied by 3 Naru aboard the enormous interdimensional city ship called the Genedar. The Naru, Ka'ara, Ka'ure, and Da'ore, aided by the holy visions of the Prophet, helped shepherd the Draenei through the stars of the Warcraft cosmos. However, mortal beings are not meant to exist in the Great Dark, and the longer they remain without a world, the more Draenei become warped by the ambient energies of the Nether.
This is an Us edition. It's kind of an alternate explanation for the broken outside of Red Pox. That's all still canon, but it helps expand the phenomena and lets us bridge the gaps between the Eridar, Draenei, and the Krokul. So you can adjust the slider to your preferred level of devolvement. All that's a little complex, but the Draenei and Broken are still essentially one race. But with our narrative, you get to decide, like a goth girl, how broken you are.
With the aid of the Naru, the Draenei hopped from world to world, ever pursued by the Legion until one of the 3 Naru, Ka'ara, for whatever reason, without warning went ballistic and entered the void state of its life cycle. The resulting chaos caused the Genedar to crash into the planet Draenor, and left the void Ka'ara suspended in the atmosphere above Shadowmoon Valley, Ka'ure trapped within the Genedar, and Da'ore in a severe state of dead. Naru, however, don't do dead like the rest of us, big dramatic kaleidoscopes that they are, and as such, the remains of Dore, tinged with void corruption, began to draw the souls of deceased Draenei to them like a magnet, which in turn led to the construction of Alkendune, where they interred the remains of Dore and established the Auchenai to tend the restless souls of the dead. Our Nikoro counted himself among their number, translating to WoW language as a more traditional shadow priest before that spec became fixated on void magic. Having miraculously survived the, get ready to count, flight from Argus, the crash of the Genedar, the genocide of the Draenei, the shattering of Outland, and even the decimation of Auchendune, Nikoro finds himself too familiar with death, and uses his dark but gentle arts to help others cope with their losses. As the Illidari begin to draw the more direct attention of the Legion, he joins his people aboard the Exodar in an attempt to flee, one last time, to a new world.
Yeah, Harkin knows how to fly spaceship.
0 for 2 on spaceship landings, the Exodar crashed into the secluded island of Azure Mist, where the Draenei had to deal with the magical runoff from the damaged Naru ship infecting the local fauna and flora.
Hey, remember when you said these guys were supposed to be Hellspawn?
Before confronting their demonic pursuers on the adjoining island, Bloodmist. The story of the Isles introduces us to Draenei political leaders such as Vindicator Murad, one of our last outstanding comic book action figure characters, Vindicator Boros, one of the leaders of the Hand of Argus, the Draenei Paladin Order, the spiritual shaman Nabundo, one of the Broken who has embraced the Orc's path to the elementals after losing his own connection to the light, the Grand Artificer Ramul, who actually wouldn't be introduced till Warlords of Draenor, but we're big on retroactive continuity here, and even the Prophet Velen himself, locked in deep meditation aboard the wreckage of the Exodar. This is around the time the canonical joining questlines for these races take place, but unlike the Night Elves and the Forsaken, this event actually already happens in-game, and it doesn't require us to ass-pull a whole legendary questline.
As fun as that is.
The Blood Elves, while fighting remnant pockets of the Scourge in the Ghostlands, are eventually contacted by representatives of the Forsaken, whose Dark Lady has not forgotten the love of her homeland, and sends her forces to aid the Elves. Together they bring down the Scourge Overlord, the traitor Magister Darkhan Drathir, who is at this point more Lich than Elf. While the Elven story focuses on vengeance against the Scourge, we flip side to the Draenei story, which centers on continuing to evade the demons that pursue them. The Draenei questline has them gathering allies and acclimating to the world around them. They make friends with some of the local furbolgs, come to the aid of an amusingly named Alliance Admiral Odysseus, and ultimately square off against a Minari Iridar named Sironas, as she hunts the Draenei in the name of her master Kil'jaeden.
There's actually a pretty funny quest where you speed around the island warning your allies of a pending Blood Elf invasion. The guy who sends you on the quest is named Kessel, so the quest is called the Kessel Run.
God, I miss this era of quest design. design. The deaths of Darkon and Saronis solidify the bonds of the new races with their new factions. Despite his shift in narrative relevance, I do still think it would be Lorthamar who negotiates the introduction of the Blood Elves into the Horde. Kilthos will have to sort that out later, but the Regent Lord reunites with his former commander, the Banshee Queen, and pledges the Sin'dorei to the Horde in exchange for their continued aid. While Velen, following the defeat of another in a long line of Minari pursuers, receives a vision from the Holy Light, one that shows his people joining with the Grand Alliance, and so sends envoys to their closest representative, Tyrande Whisperwind, who helps foster their new compact from one theocracy to another. As a former noble and diplomat, Lady Tannen would have been sent to Orgrimmar and eventually finds the Thunderslayers, while Nikoro would have followed the instructions of Velen's prophetic foresight and made his way to Stormwind and the Ash Knights.
Hold up, now the Horde Guild has 2 rogues, and the Alliance Guild has 2 priests.
Yes. Excellent time to bring that up. You see, around the end of the Karazhan raid, our moon priestess Theta Saberfang began to behave out of sorts. Remembering she had once served in the Moon Guard under the Betrayer himself, her companions chalked it up to difficult memories, but then one night, without warning, she vanished, leaving behind no message or indication of her plans. For the time being, we'll leave it as Theta being MIA. Her spot will actually be filled for a short time by none other than Shang, the Pandaren Brewmaster, who will travel with the Ash Knights to Outland.
Honoring that famous alliance, Pandaren rumor.
Though still formally declining to join the Knights, he's nevertheless happy to help out while they look for their lost friend. The Thunderslayers, the Ash Knights,
And the panda.
make their way to the Dark Portal. They brace themselves, give a polite nod to the opposing faction, then charge right through the depths of time and space, into the Dark Portal and out the other side, taking their first steps on the shattered world of Outland. Now let me tell you, for those of you who've never had this moment, this was biblical. I know the Wrathgate may have been WoW's first true cinematic, but it was the Stair of Destiny that first truly took my breath away. An army of demon NPCs led by an enormous pit commander, all clashing against an amalgamation of Azerothian heroes. Not just the Alliance and Horde, but the Cenarian Circle, the Argent Dawn, the Earthen Ring, and the Kirin Tor. This moment didn't just feel like an expansion, it felt like a war between 2 worlds, and we got to be right there in the thick of it.
Chapter 2, The Burning Crusade, Part 1, Before the Storm.
The story from here branches off in about 7 different directions, in keeping with the 7 zones of Outland. Hellfire Peninsula, Terokkar Forest, Zangarmarsh, Blade's Edge Mountain, Nagrand, Netherstorm, and Shadowmoon Valley. These should be more than familiar to everyone right now, considering the video got delayed till after the TBC Classic Anniversary Edition drop. The Horde and the Alliance find their footing in the new world with the aid of new allies themed around the expansion. For the Horde, this is a homecoming. The Orcs return to their motherland, but bring with them the new elements of who they have become since their departure. While for the Alliance, the discovery of the surviving members of the Alliance expedition from Warcraft 2 is less a homecoming and more of a reunion tour. The Sons of Lothar steal the show here, considering we'd been staring at their statues for 4 real-world years and something near a decade in-game. And as a result, the Horde presence, while consistent, feels a bit hollow. That's a problem, so our solution is to add in Horde characters to contrast the Sons of Lothar with a less formal Horde group we're dubbing the Founders of Durotar. The big face of that group is Rexxar, who's already present, as is Nazgrel.
Not to be confused with Nazgrim.
But aside from that, there's a lot of one-off characters representing Horde events on Outland, so we thought we could deepen the ties a bit by adding in characters like Rokon, Samuro, Gazlo, and maybe even Boban Wind Totem.
To be honest, Jen Stormstout is probably considered a member of this group as well.
Hopefully these founding fathers can give the Sons of Lothar a run for their money, since, while not openly at war, and even actively cooperating on the Stair of Destiny, the 2 factions do still clash throughout the 7 zones for control of world PvP structures and other spaces.
These kids these days, they don't know what it was like to battle for control of a summoning stone. We had daily quests. So many daily quests!
For the most part, though, the faction conflict is a secondary matter. The 2 guilds are not here together, but they're on a parallel journey, not a perpendicular one this time. Something else I particularly like about Outland's design is that the TBC dungeons are rarely ever one-off instances. This seems to stem from a desire to maximize the use of different design assets, and as a result, we were given massive dungeon complexes in each zone that contain 2 or 3 dungeons capped with a big character-themed raid at the end. These complexes are how we tell the story of 2.0, and they're also how we explore the dream team Illidan has brought together and show that they are slowly but surely falling apart.
Alright, enough about concepts. Let's take this thing down real gentle like the Exodar.
Right.
Hellfire Peninsula.
The guilds wade through the carnage of the Stair of Destiny before splitting off and heading their own ways. The Ash Knights make their way to Honorhold, where they're introduced to the first member of the Sons of Lothar, Danath Trollbane, nephew of the legendary King Thoris of Stromgard, and one of Azeroth Weekly's top grizzled old dudes, leading what remains of the original vanguard out of the crumbling fortress of Honorhold. The conflict here is that while the surviving soldiers are hardened, they are also weathered, and though they refuse to go out with a fight, more and more of them are worn away with each passing day. While the Thunderslayers make their way to the newly founded Thrallmar, where Nazgrel, Thrall's head head of security and warrior of the Frostwolf clan, directs Horde operations throughout the Shattered Realm. In many ways, Hellfire Peninsula serves as a microcosm of Outland as a whole. As the two above bases establish the allies we came to this world with, there are also two bases for the new races. The Temple of Telemat for the Alliance, where a sect of Draenei called the Omenai have chosen to remain on Outland and preserve their holy sites, and Falcon Watch, a Horde Blood Elf settlement trying to establish contact with their new Orcish allies. There's a lot going on in Hellfire, from meeting the half-elf Arator the Redeemer, who has journeyed with us to Outland to find his missing parents,
Alaria and Terralion,
to the enormous ground-shaking Fell Reaver, who despite being the size of a skyscraper, will still manage to sneak up on you and flatten you like imminent domain. In the end, though, it all leads up to Hellfire Citadel. The dark, jagged scar upon the landscape, former seat of the war chief, Black Hand the Destroyer, and the staging point for both the genocide of the Draenei and the original invasion of Azeroth, now serves as the center of operations for the Fell-forged orcs of the Fell Horde, as well as the prison for the deposed former Lord of Outland, Magtheridon. Kargath Bladefist, in his utter madness, following the consumption of even more Pitlord blood, has pushed his body to the limits of modification, replacing not merely his fist, but both arms, one of his eyes, much of his organs, and probably a chunk of his brain. Now a monstrosity of Fell magic and machinery, Kargath directs the Fell orcs on the front lines of the conflict, while simultaneously harvesting Magtheridon's body for Illidan's rituals. I think the guilds would probably run the dungeons as strike force operations on the ramparts, the blood furnace, and finally the Shattered Hall. But the final showdown with Kargath would now take place in Magtheridon's lair. As the Pitlord is slain for the final time, Kargath revels in the blood and the Fell power, warping beyond sanity and blitzing the guilds. Representing everything about the old Horde that Thrall's new Horde rejects, the death of Kargath is symbolic. Here now lies one of the original heroes of the Horde, made a mockery of himself by the corrupting influence of demons.
Terokkar Forest.
I'm sure many of you expected Zangarmarsh to be next, and traditionally you'd be right, but for now, the guilds will pass through the fungal swamplands before being sent on to the lush woodlands of Terokkar. This zone is most well known for the city of Shattrath, but we're actually not going to get into that sanctuary city today. The factions within the city take center stage during the war against Illidan, so we'll talk about them during that segment. Even without the Grand City, though, Terokkar is not without its fun. For one, this is the zone that introduced us to the Arakoa, high up on the list of most wanted playable races.
Yeah, on a scale of Drogbar to Tuskar, they're probably right above Hosen.
The Avians were responsible for one of the oldest empires on Draenor before their fall from grace. Now, due to a series of betrayals, failed revolutions, coups, and deicides, the entire species has been cursed to lose its wings and do impressions of the Skeksis from Dark Crystal. The zone also houses Alarian Stronghold, an outpost of Alliance-aligned High Elves, run by a lieutenant of the notably absent Illyria Windrunner named Captain Auric Sunchaser, and the Stonebreaker Hold, an abandoned Maghar village now inhabited by members of the Horde and led by, let's go with, Spirit Walker Bovan Wind Totem, yet another one of Durotar's founding fathers. However, if we're not looking at Shattrath, the real draw of the zone is Auchindoun, located directly at the center of the Bone Waste. The once radiant, now decimated Draenei Mausoleum City was brought low by the machinations of Terran Gorfiend following the destruction of Shattrath. The forces of the Shadow Council clashed with the Auchinai, led by their exarch Maladar, Speaker for the Dead, and in the chaos of battle, Gorfiend, aided by Grandmaster Vorpil, conducted a ritual to effectively drop the base on the temple by summoning whatever murmur is. Described as the very essence of sound, its arrival on the plane disrupted the air itself, erupting from the depths of Auchindoun, leveling the surrounding forest and creating the Bone Waste. Many died in the explosion, yet the void-touched heart of Doore still remained, and so the various darkened forces of the area seek to plunder the tomb's depths and utilize its power. Though not one of Illidan's flunkies, Exarch Maladar should steal the show here. It's understated in-game, but it's implied that Maladar was once a gentle hero amongst the Draenei, and his madness should be framed as a tragedy for their people. As the guilds battle outcast Arakoa cultists, agents of the Ethereal Consortium, and remnants of the Shadow Council's forces, I'd like Maladar to be an ever-lingering presence, not only in the Auchinai crypts, but also in the Mana Tombs, the Sethek Halls, and the Shadow Labyrinth. As the players battle and defeat the Shadow Council's surviving leader, Grandmaster Vorpil, Maladar would reveal himself and, in his maddened grief, attack the party, requiring them to put him down. The clashing magics and the agony of the two cursed souls would result in the resummoning of Murmur, or at least a portion of him, leading the guilds to end the creature once and for all. With the death of the fallen Exarch, our own Auchinai priest, Nikoro, would mourn for his former master's sanity, yet rejoice in his passing, grateful for the gift of death, so that his soul may finally find peace.
Blade's Edge Mountain.
From the arboreal hills of Terokkar to the rugged windswept knife peaks of Blade's Edge Mountain, Hellfire Peninsula might hold the central spot in Outland's iconography, but I think it's Blade's Edge Mountain that works best as a proof of concept for what Outland is meant to be. Warped, unnatural mountain ranges twisted into too perfect and too numerous spines that decorate the entire landscape. It's not quite so implausible as Netherstorm, but also not so mundane that someone might retire here and raise their family. This zone focuses on the other Draenor native warmonger race that invaded Azeroth and became became a staple of the franchise, ogres, and their masters, the Graan, mountain-sized monsters who evoke early Greek myths of the cruel Cyclops archetype. The oldest and most powerful of the still-living Graan, Gruul, has enslaved the remaining ogres of the region, sired 7 sons.
If Gruul the last of Graan, who he make baby with?
Shh! And most impressive of all, 1v1'd Deathwing during his Outland vacation and took 4 lesser black dragons and impaled them on the mountain ranges of Flex. The Alliance and Horde enter the zone and immediately make their way to their respective base camps, as is going to become pretty formulaic in this chapter and even the series as a whole. The Alliance head to Toshli's station.
Wait, I thought the Alliance base in this zone was Sylvanar.
In the main timeline, that's true, but 1, Sylvanar bore no real connection to this zone that couldn't be directly replicated elsewhere, and 2, Toshli's station feels a little more iconic in this instance. It was the first ever entirely gnome-run town in the game, full stop, and Toshli himself was a bit of a droll icon, interacting with players in an amusing, I'm kind of over the whole adventurer thing dynamic. However, it's the Horde side of the story that really dominates this zone, through Rexxar and his search for his lost clan, the Mok Nathal. Specifically, his father, Leerox, who leads the clan of ogres, orcs, and half-breeds. Shockingly pacifistic for a race born of the shared blood between 2 of Warcraft's most bloodthirsty races. Back in the day, old Leerox rejected an invitation to join the old Horde and argued with Rexxar until he decided to leave the clan and join the Horde anyways. The pair hadn't spoken since, making the reunion a pretty powerful moment. Rexxar starts his story in the abandoned Thunderlord stronghold, made from the bones of a long-dead Colossus, and ends up finding his father in Mok Nathal village. The journey from A to B makes the story impactful not only for Rexxar, but for our Magus as well, returning to an ancestral village she'd have no memory of outside of tales told by her mentor. Besides the Horde and Alliance villages, other points of interest in the region include Ograla, a settlement of ogres led by Mogdorg, the Wizened, who have advanced their intelligence with a Pexus Crystal and now seek the betterment and liberation of their race.
Isn't it the Wizened?
Damn it, you're probably right, but that's not a word.
Sounds like a good word to hearken.
There's also the human, Baron Sablemain, who bears a grudge against the Graan and later reveals that he is the shockingly reasonable Black Dragon Sibelian, former right hand to Deathwing himself, holding a grudge specifically against Gruul the Dragon Killer. Can't imagine why. Actually, just about everybody in this zone is holding a grudge against the colossal Graan. Mogdorg desiring freedom for the ogres, Sablemain desiring revenge, Rexxar to ensure the safety of his clan.
And the hell with it. Let's throw in Toshli in there to test his big gun. And everyone who wants the DST trinket.
The story will still culminate in Gruul's lair, but that single instance 2-boss raid doesn't quite weigh in with the other dungeon complexes, so we'll be supplementing it with the Ring of Blood.
That's in Nagrand.
Wait, really? Then what is Sablemain standing outside of?
That's the Circle of Blood.
Damn it, orcs! Fine, then we're combining the contents of the various circumferences of blood to make an arena-style dungeon that pits the guilds against a series of match-style foes, including several Sons of Gruul, before finally being granted an audience in the Greater Lair where they will take down the Gigas once and for all.
Nagrand.
Often called the last unscarred region of Outland, the lush green hills of Nagrand serve as a final preservation of what Draenor might have been like before the coming of the demons and the shattering of the world. Nagrand is one of the most beautiful zones in all of Warcraft, and I know a decent number of players who would log in every day just to sit around here and enjoy the sights. For the Alliance, the zone held Telar, a village of broken Draenei calling themselves the Kurenai, who sought to find harmony after losing their connection to the light and exploring the Draenei connection to shamanism, showing that spirituality itself, and not one particular devotion, is the core of Draenei culture and society. But for the Horde, once more, the zone tells a more emotional story. The village of Garadar, inhabited by the still brown-skinned Maghar, remains one of the last vestiges of orc culture absent demonic influence. These orcs collectively rejected the blood of Manaroth and were considered weak and unworthy by the rest of the orcs. Consequently, Garadar also became home to any young orcs who contracted red pox, meaning we get introduced to numerous scions of the old Horde who were unable to follow their fathers to war, such as Joran Deadeye, son of Kilrog, Uranosh Sarfang, son of Varrock,
Oh yeah, that Sarfang.
and of course, most notably, Garrosh Hellscream, the son of Grom, who lives in a state of perpetual shame, knowing his father was the first to drink the blood of the Pit Lord that damned his entire race. It's not exactly his time yet, but I don't think it can be overstated that this small scene, where Thrall meets Garrosh and with the aid of Drekthar, shows him the last glorious moments of his father, redeeming the name Hellscream in the eyes of the last orc to bear it, will come to utterly define the Warcraft franchise for no less than the next 8 years, and in fact, until Thrall starts acting like a shaman again, you can argue that it's still affecting WoW. Anyway, all the Maghar live under the guidance of Great Mother Gaia, an elder orc shaman and Thrall's last surviving blood relative. His paternal grandmother, who, after he saves from illness, finally reveals to him his true name, given to him by Durotan and Draka, Goel. Since the zone traditionally lacks a formal dungeon, That left a lot of room for extra quest lines. Hemet Nessingwari, for one, is back, and is now in Outland because the beasts here are bigger. Altruis the Sufferer, a demon hunter who, having watched the madness grow within Illidan's heart and mind, abandoned the Illidari and now actively hunts them alongside the Legion. He's actually the first to pass on word of Theta Saberfang to the Ash Knights, having encountered her relatively recently, but being unaware of her current whereabouts. Gurg Thok and Woden the Troll also previously appeared here in the aforementioned Ring of Blood, but will now have a more prominent role in the Blade's Edge Mountain Arena. Lan Tresser of the Blade, a half-orc, half-drawn-eye blade master, who will probably be assisting Altruis with the demon hunt. And finally, a new addition on our end, at the Throne of the Elements, the guilds will encounter Medan, who, after the events of Karazhan, is now traveling with the shaman Rhaegar Earthfury, as well as several shamans from the Earthen Ring in an attempt to understand the elemental nature of chaos magic. True to form, he gets close to understanding the 4 different elements, but each time true comprehension eludes him. The guilds even start brawling once again over the beautiful waterfall village of Hala, but the story will all culminate around the true icon of Nagrand, Ashugan. Considered to be a holy mountain by the orcs, and the largest diamond in existence by the ethereals, it is in reality the crashed Naru ship, the Genadar, and within its halls, the Naru Kure still sits in quiet meditation. Over the years, Ashugan had begun to draw the spirits of the orc ancestors towards it in the same way that Daore's remains had drawn the spirits of the Draenei, and in the modern day, its halls have been seized by agents of the Shadow Council and the Burning Legion. I'll be honest, there's no evidence to back this next statement, but I swear this was always meant to be a dungeon. Just look at it. The forces of the Legion operating out of Kilsaro Hold are trying to take Ashugan and harvest the holy energies of Kuore for their own nefarious purposes. That has dungeon written all over it, and whether that's true or not, it definitely is one now in our story. Nabundo and the Kuranai, Garrosh and the Maghar, Medan, Altruis, Lan Tresser, and throw in Hemet just for fun, all rush into the mountain to destroy the demons and free Kuure, and make for a grand battle to inspire the new generation of Maghar.
Loktarogar, blood and wait, who is the boss of this dungeon?
Right, that's important. Okay, there's a character in Netherstorm who's got a surprising amount of lore, but who everyone ignores because that's the Kael'thas and Ethereal Zone. Sokrathar, an Eredar lord who is unique for having actually been a Draenei, and not simply a Minari native to Argus. What that means is that he chose to follow Velen, then later chose to betray the Draenei and join the Legion.
Like Cypher from the Matrix.
Precisely. In that way, it feels rather fitting for him to be the Legion presence attempting to retake the Genadar.
He was actually the Exarch of the Shatari, so trying to capture a Naru is even more on brand.
Plus, this gives us at least one dungeon in the Burning Crusade launch zones that is aligned specifically with the Legion and not just with Illidan.
Shadowmoon Valley.
The blasted, blighted battlescar of the Burning Legion's blasphemy on Draenor, where once was a serene glade bathed in eternal starlight, is now a jagged, tarnished hellscape bathed in rivers of molten fellfire, with an ever-present storm of infernals literally raining from the sky at all hours of the day. This is rightfully the final zone of the expansion.
Maybe it's tied with Netherstorm.
But I swear we're building to something here, so just bear with us. The footholds in this zone are not so much built as they are claimed from the ruins of the Shadowmoon clan, and repurposed as Alliance and Horde strongholds. What was once Anguishar Fortress has been claimed by Kurdran Wildhammer, another statue from the Valley of Heroes, positioned there with the rest of the Wildhammer Griffin Riders who joined the Sons of Lothar in the invasion of Outland. Meanwhile, the Horde camp of Shadowmoon Village, presumably once the settlement of Shazgul, houses a large contingent of the Korkron Guard, and once again, in the name of bringing the Durotar founders into the story, the outpost is now led by the Blade Master Semiro. Most of this zone deals with the build-up to the Black Temple raid, which we're actually not going to get into this video. However, there are several seriously big names in the zone that should not go overlooked. For one is Lady Sinistra, who is in reality the last surviving mate of Deathwing, broodmother of the Black Dragonflight Sinantharia. She's engaged in a power struggle over the curious Outland-bred Nether Dragons and their leader, Neltharaku, caught between their Black Dragon cousins and the compounding presence of the Dragonmaw clan. The original Dragon Riders of the Second War, led by Zulahed the Whack, yet another of the original clan leaders from the Old Horde and one of the masterminds behind the imprisonment and other terrible, unmentionable on YouTube things that happened to the dragon aspect Alexstrasza. Perhaps even more important than them, though, is the presence of the mysterious Wraith warning you of the machinations of Terran Gorefiend, sending you all over the zone gathering his belongings to halt the Death Knight's revival, which is totally not suspicious at all. As we mentioned, this zone's raid is the Black Temple. But for me, Black Temple is the final raid of Outland as a whole, and so for a proper cap to Shadowmoon Valley, we're adding in another raid similar to Ashugan, the Hand of of Gul'dan, the massive fell volcano at the center of the zone where Gul'dan once read the Cipher of Damnation and utterly severed Draenor's connection to the elements, and the Orcs' connection along with it. The story of the zone will culminate at the summit of the blasphemous volcano, and since this is the zone where players were first able to purchase flying mounts, I think it's rather fitting that flight play a part in the zone.
Oh god, not a flying mount dungeon. Those are terrible.
Yeah, but they're great on paper, and the good news is we never have to play this off of paper. Players will take to the skies battling Sinestra and Neltharaku, among others, while on the backs of griffins and wyverns, weaving through the never-ending hail of infernals, and eventually making landfall on the mountain itself and battling their way up to the peak, where they will come face to face with old Zulahed. Now, Zulahed was by no means a good guy. But what made him interesting was that he, alone amongst the old horde, rejected the magics of the warlocks and continued to practice elemental shamanism. It was unique and almost unexplainable. His stooge, Necro Skullcrusher, embraced the Shadow Council's teachings, yet Zulahed himself never did. It presented him as a morally complex character, fighting for his clan's place in the New World, fighting to preserve his people and their culture, regardless of that cost. Then, by the time we meet him in-game, he's joined Illidan and become a warlock without explanation at all.
That's whack.
Agreed. Lame. I prefer the idea of him as a fallen shaman, not allied with Illidan, but desperately trying to seize control of the Nether Drakes to regain his clan's prominence. That desperation finds him standing at the very spot where his people's culture was taken from him, where the Orcs' connection to the land was severed, atop the Hand of Gul'dan. And in his hand, he holds the Cipher of Damnation. By his side floats the mysterious Shadowmoon Wraith, whispering lies and false promises of the return of his elemental power. Zulahed performs the ritual, utterly lost to madness, in a way that might mirror the downfall of Exarch Maladar. The guilds are forced to stop him, and another legend the Old Horde is killed. But his life provides the fuel for the ritual, and the Wraith seizes the opportunity, revealing itself to actually be the spirit of Terran Gorefiend. The Death Knight mocks the heroes and murders the Vindicator spirit who had been preventing his revival, before resuming his corporeal form and riding off towards the Black Temple, bringing the story of the Cursed Land to a close for now.
Netherstorm.
Speaking of Illidan, it's been too long since we discussed one of his operations directly. Outland is often described as a shattered world, and when we invoke that kind of imagery, I think what most people expected was Netherstorm, a desolate cluster of barren rocks floating amidst a swirl of fell and arcane energy. This zone is by far the least hospitable to mortal life and contains very few settlements in-game. Neither the Horde or the Alliance have managed a strong foothold in the region, and only the goblins of Area 52 were reckless enough to attempt to colonize.
Let's have Gazlowe hang out here.
Yeah, sure. This is also the zone that gave us our first non-hostile interaction with the Ethereals, a race of energy mummies who hail from a world devoured by the Void, and who give the goblins a run for their money on the concept of monetization over morality. The Consortium, led by Nexus Prince Haramud, is a loose confederate of ethereal merchants, craftsmen, and thieves based out of the Stormspire in Netherstorm, a formerly Draenei tower used to stabilize the ecology of the region. There's also two small additions I'd like to make in the zone to sort of round out the adventure, one for the Horde and one for the Alliance. Not full-on settlements, as that sort of takes away from the harshness of the zone, but base camps for small factional operations. Firstly, the NPCs from Sylvanar, which we removed from Blade's Edge. I'd like to bring them into this zone as a force of Kaldori working towards the same goals as the Ecodome Ethereals. For the Horde, I'd also like to include a regiment of the Royal Apothecary Society, operating out of the ruins of Farallon and studying the effects of the Nether on their alchemical concoctions. Out here, I'd like the Sylvanar to be led by Fandral Staghelm.
What's he gonna do? Plant some trees?
To give him a bit more screen time, and the RAS to be led by Grand Apothecary Putris, under that same theory.
Oh, that bastard.
The last oddity worth mentioning is the ruins of Kirinvar village, once an Alliance expedition, i.e. Sons of Lothar encampment and home of Archmage Vargoth.
A lot of people seem to forget that Khadgar, while a mage, was actually the supreme commander of the entire expedition, and it was Vargoth who led the mages directly, with his sweet staff.
Between then and now, around the time that Netherstorm went from being the remnants of Farallon to the vortex that it is today, the town was destroyed and the Archmage was trapped within his tower by none other than Prince Kael'thas Sunstrider, who is also responsible for the mana forges that threaten to destabilize what little life remains in Netherstorm. The Prince in our new story will not ultimately become the villain of this expansion. However, his character is one that will do anything to save his people, and that is the role he plays out here in this moment. The retinue of Sindori that followed Kael to Outland are known as the Sun Fury, and they share the prince's fanatical devotion to the preservation of their race. Under this ideal, they have seized the Naru's colossal interdimensional citadel known as Tempest Keep, and have gutted much of its machinery to construct the Mana Forges, harvesting the very essence of the Nether in order to feed the Sindori's magical addiction, and save their entire race from withering into the mana-starved wretched. This single-minded pursuit, coupled with the overexposure to the swirling vortex of Nether, Arcane, and Void power, has driven Kael out of his wits, so it's up to the Thunderslayers and the Ash Knights to assault the Crystalline Fortress in order to shut down the operation of the power-mad prince. The story of the zone now has 5 narrative leaders operating against 1 mana forge each. Fendril, Putris, Gazlo, and Vargoth directing efforts against the 4 Sun Fury-controlled forges, Ada, Banar, Koru, and Duro, while the Ethereals focus their efforts on Manaforge Ultris, which has both exploded and been seized by the forces of the Void, now used as an entry point for the Void Lord Dimensius, the creature responsible for the destruction of the ethereal homeworld, Koresh, and the reason the race as a whole lost their physical bodies.
Over the next 2 decades, every single word in this sentence will get mined for content, but we're going to ignore all that right now, just like Blizzard did.
This is where I think I would introduce our last neutral PC, for now anyways. Metzan the Peddler, a not official member of the consortium who will show up anytime I need an inexplicable neutral plot hook for the guilds, and as a proxy for all in-game systems that cannot be explained through the narrative. He'll be hanging with Professor Debiri here, coordinating the fight against the last Manaforge, before the guilds eventually take the battle to the Sun Prince himself. The floating citadels of Tempest Keep,
3 smaller ships, absent the stolen Exodar, and 1 central keep,
make up the raid complex of Netherstorm. The battle starts in the Mechanar, putting a stop to the machinery of the Manaforges, followed by the Botanica to put an end to any research in bioarcane weaponry, and finally to the Arcatraz to prevent the release of the dangerous beings held within the Naru prison ship,
with the exception of Millhouse Manastorm, one of Blizzard's bafflingly durable running gags.
And one by one, the fortress ships fall to the Knights and the Slayers until only the eye remains. This fight can take place just as it had in the canon, with Kel'Thas transfixed by the pursuit of power, and as you fight him, using those 7 legendary weapons he drops, the more desperate and unhinged he becomes. The Sun Fury elves under his command will work as instigators and enablers, whispering in his ear, piling the stress higher and higher until he finally snaps. The ravings of the prince during the battle should sound like a fever dream. Every waking nightmare, every stress-induced spiral, all manifest as he lashes out at the party, until finally he's brought down. Wounded, but alive. No setbacks here. Lady Tannen, in this moment, would take steps to transport her mad leader back to a place of safety, probably Shatrath, where his mind can be healed and his spirit can rest. Now, before long, the Sin'dorei must force themselves to consider new options in the face of their addictions. But for now, at least, the prince sleeps, enjoying even the briefest moment of respite.
Zangarmarsh.
At last, sitting at the heart of the shattered world's disembodied continents, repurposed for our story as the final zone of 2.0, Zangarmarsh, where allies from the Cenarian Circle are studying the bizarre mushrooms that appear to contain a level of sentience. In this zone, we're introduced to yet another species of Outland natives, the Sporelings of Sporagar, and we get to clash with the nearly feral Lost Ones, a further devolved state of the Draenei alongside their Illidari Naga masters. The Slayers make their way to the village of Zabra Jin, a Darkspear encampment, to which we're adding in Rokan, who has been tasked with searching for a way to halt the operations of the Coilfang in the area, and the Knights find their way to Telrador, a Draenei monastery situated atop a giant mushroom that once served as a hidden sanctuary for the survivors of the Orcish genocide. The whole of Zangarmarsh is crawling,
Or should we say slithering?
with Lady Vash's Coilfang Naga, and their goal seems almost laughably mundane when compared to the almost nuclear magical pursuits of the other zones. You see, Outland, now a chunk of rock suspended in the twisting nether, has only one major source of viable fresh water left, and the Naga intend to control that source and deliver it into the hands of Illidan Stormrage. Coilfang Reservoir sits at the heart of the marsh, its machinery pumping away at the lakes, stockpiling water like Immortan Joe's big-ass rock. While the looming walls of Black Temple remain sealed, the heart of Illidan's operation, Lady Vash, carries out his will and is entrusted with the guard of his most hated enemy, Maiev Shadowsong.
Originally, she was kept in Shadowmoon Valley, right?
Yes, that's correct, but the fortress called Warden's Cage can just as easily be situated here, and I find it hard to believe that Illidan, mad as he was, would have trusted any one of his scheming underlings aside from Vash with keeping the single-minded hatred of the Warden at bay. The final conflict of Outland's opening chapters should be the fight against Lady Vash's forces. The Coilfang Reservoir works to control not a Naru's essence, or a demonic pit lord's blood, but simply water, the last viable waters of Outland. And we cannot let them have it. This simple motivation is one that the whole of Outland would be equally invested in, and that allows us to take this concept and turn it into the true patch finale it needs to become. All the races across the last 6 adventures would arrive to halt Vash's plans, and battle with the mind-boggling ecology of what was once the Zangar Sea. The Knights and the Slayers beat out their frustrations on the Naga in Coilfang Reservoir, liberating the slave pens, decimating the Underbog, and dismantling the Steam Vault, finally shattering the bindings on the Warden's Cage, before at last entering Serpent Shrine Caverns. Lady Vash, the Naga Sea Witch, is the last of Illidan's servants, save for the missing Akama, and perhaps the only one that was ever truly loyal to him. This got retconned later on, far after the fact, as her being sent to spy on Illidan by Ashara, but I'm canning that. While Kargath was fixated on his own slaughter modifications, and Gruul cared only for securing his own tribute, and Kael'thas worked feverishly to sate his people's arcane hunger hunger, and Akama obsessively sought to reclaim his temples, and Gorfine's motivations are, at this point, known only to himself, Vashj alone truly sought control in Illidan's name, and she now falls upon the guilds in an attempt to prevent the liberation of the Betrayer's greatest enemy. Yet for all her devotion, Vashj meets the same fate as the others, and without her, Illidan has only Akama and Gorfine left in his service. And whether he realizes it in his madness, his operations are dismantled across the whole of Outlands. His last bastion of power, the Black Temple, now sits directly in our sights, and his greatest enemy, the Warden Maiev Shadowsong, is now free to hunt him once again. And that's where we're going to end for today.
Nailed it! Another 10-minute video. Yeah, these really aren't getting any shorter, are they?
No, they sure aren't. I've probably got some serious thinking to do on how I handle the future of this series. But for now, let's call it a day. Join us next time as we handle the 4 patch raids of the Burning Crusade.
Hagen smash!
Wait, what do you mean 4?
We'll see you soon.